Hi guys, this is ANDREI, Horizon City News, and one of the subscribers I have, named Envy, he had asked for some information about Proposition K, which is going through the El Paso city government, and it deals with like environmental issues for the city of El Paso. I found a video which was very recently made, and it deals specifically with Proposition K, the entire video. It's like narrated, and the discussion is organized by one of the KTSM news people, and he does a great job, and they have a lawyer on there, and another guy that's involved in the whole environmental issues with the city of El Paso. So yeah, here's the video which Envy had asked for, or here's a video which I think might interest Envy and many people like him regarding Proposition K in El Paso, which I guess is coming up for a vote. And yeah, that's what this video is going to be about. Proposition K in El Paso, Texas in 2023. All right, guys, I'll be in touch. My contact information is down below. Thanks for watching Horizon City News.
Hello, I'm Aaron Montes of KTEP News. In collaboration with PBS El Paso, we're hosting a panel discussion on Proposition K. It is one of several City of El Paso propositions that will be on the May 6th election. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my front, we have Dominic Chacon of Sunrise El Paso, Andrea Hutchins of the El Paso Chamber, and Veronica Carbajal of the Community First Coalition. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And so we're going to be giving each one of our panelists about 2.5 minutes to answer each question. If we get a little bit past that, I will let you all know, and we will continue our discussion. And before we get started in our discussion, I want to remind our audience about climate change. It is a reference to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. However, respected science institutions and government agencies such as the United Nations and Environmental Protection Agency say a main driver for these warmer temperatures is due to human activity, primarily the burning of fossil fuels, coal, and oil. I'm actually going to be reading the layout of the proposition as you will see it on your ballots. It reads, should the city charter be amended as proposed by a petition to add Article 9 to create a climate policy requiring the city to use all available resources and authority to accomplish 3 goals: to reduce the city's contribution to climate change, invest in an environmentally sustainable future, and advance the cause of climate justice; to require the City Council to employ a climate director who shall be appointed and removed by City Council and report directly to City Council; to require the creation of a climate department to be directly overseen by the climate director; to require the creation of a 9-member climate commission appointed by City Council with recommending and investigative powers for the purposes of overseeing the implementation and fulfillment of a city climate policy, with removing of individual members only for incompetence or nonfeasance, misfeasance or malfeasance in office; to require the creation of an annual goal for climate jobs and the adoption and implementation of a policy that will transfer current city employees to climate work and provide a preference for contractors who are able to advance the city's climate policy; to require the creation of an annual solar power generation plan for the city of El Paso, and to require the city manager to establish and maintain policies that encourage the development of rooftop solar power generation capacity within the city of El Paso using existing city facilities, require both new buildings and retrofitted buildings to include solar power generation capacity, to require the employment of all available methods so that all energy used within the city is generated by clean renewable energy, with the goals of requiring 80% clean renewable energy by 2030 and 100% clean renewable energy by 2045, to require the city of El Paso to employ all available efforts to convert El Paso Electric to municipal ownership, to require the City of El Paso to undertake all necessary efforts to prepare city infrastructure to withstand extreme weather conditions, and ensure uninterrupted provision of basic services and utilities to city residents, to require the City of El Paso to ban the use of city water for fossil fuel industry activities, defined to include El Paso Electric, outside of the city limits, and prohibit the City of El Paso from selling or transferring any water for purposes of fossil fuel industry activities outside of the city limits, or otherwise allow any city water to be used for such purposes, to prohibit the City of El Paso from imposing any fees, fines, or other financial or non-financial burdens that limit the purchase, use, or generation of renewable energy, and nullifying any such fees, fines, or other burdens in existence at the time the charter amendment takes effect. I will remind the audience that many cities throughout our country have adopted policies to address climate change. Cities such as Houston, Austin, Colorado Springs, and others are looking to renewable energy initiatives and cutting greenhouse gas emissions. There's also talk of electrifying transportation, energy efficiency, and even creating jobs. Which leads me to my first question, Ms. Carbajal. What has the discussion about climate change been like in the city of El Paso, and are we talking about it enough?
Oh my goodness, no, we are not talking about it enough. I think I've heard more about climate change in the last month than I have in the last almost 20 years of my legal practice. I'm an environmental studies concentrator from college, or environmental studies major in college, and also environmental lawyer at Legal Aid. And I've had a number of environmental cases, even in El Paso. I was the lead attorney in the air permit contest against El Paso Electric in the Montana Vista neighborhood in 2013. And, we've seen different movements arise, usually around a single polluter like a SARCO. I was also involved with that fight back in 2005 and on. And I don't believe that we've had a serious conversation since the SARCO about environmental jobs. And with the Montana Vista fight, the fight was led primarily by the residents. We did have some environmental supporters, but it was us against a big company. And it wasn't until the issue, came upon a New York Times reporter that we actually had a serious conversation with the company about climate change and about what my clients were concerned about. And they were really concerned about having a huge polluter right next door, and the fact that they already had the Magellan jet fuel tank right in front of the company, and that Fort Bliss was talking about going, waste zero by having an incinerator right next to the power plant. And so with a lot of these fence line communities, the concern is always about what is happening next, not just in terms of pollution, but who else will move in. And so we were able to craft a settlement agreement where the company agreed to not expand, but for solar energy, because I knew that there was so much desert that they were going to continue to grow and grow in this fossil fuel powered energy generation unless we put a stop to it and thought ahead. And that's really what environmentalists are always trying to do, is to think ahead, including to the creation of jobs, including to taking a serious account as to how climate change is impacting jobs right now.
Ms. Hutchins, in regards to Proposition K, what are your concerns? And are there any opportunities to be had in the proposal that we as a community can work off of?
So as Ms. Carbajal was just mentioning, we definitely need to be talking more about what we can do here in El Paso, from the average El Pasoan to the business community and so on, to combat the effects of climate change. Certainly, our friends to the south need to be a part of that conversation in order for these conversations to be fruitful. We do know that a great deal of the pollution that occurs here in El Paso does come from across the border. Some folks from the EPA just recently on March 7th did weigh in on that. Beyond that, I would say that, as far as the business community goes, the chamber represents several hundred small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and a handful of large businesses in the community. Overall, the concern for everyone, I think, that we talk to is the cost. The chamber and another independent study that came out showed the cost of the climate charter being anywhere between 150 million to in the billions. And I think overall, our biggest concern is that there is no guarantee for what the cost is going to be, and that we have not seen advocates of the climate charter come out with information concerning the cost. Now, when we talk about the advantageous opportunities, certainly, as we discussed, any time where our community can talk about, positive change and hopefully work together after all of this is over, on creating positive climate initiatives in the community, I think that would be a win, obviously. But when it comes to the climate charter in general, we think that the cost is just too great and that the language is too vague. Overall, it's just very poorly written policy.
Mr. Chacon, Sunrise El Paso spearheaded the petition. Can you speak to why the organization felt it was necessary, and what is it that Sunrise El Paso is trying to achieve?
Well, big picture, we are here because we are in a climate catastrophe. We see wildfires all the time. We see hurricanes. We just saw a streak of tornadoes tear apart parts of Mississippi and Appalachia. We see in our own community hotter, drier summers. We see dust storms all the time. So, in big picture, we're here because of the negligence of past generations, and our generation is trying to step up and take responsibility for how we move forward. When it pertains to the climate charter, we're here because of other negligence, specifically from people who claim that they are leaders in our community. This climate charter did not come out of nowhere, right? We started fighting during the sale of El Paso Electric against JP Morgan Chase, a billion-dollar bank, which is one of the top abusers of the climate of our planet Earth. We fought against Newman 6, which was locking us into more decades of non-renewable energies that are poisoning communities in our own backyard, like Chaparral. The climate charter is a culmination of all those efforts of young people saying that we are tired of the lip service provided by corporations who say that they really care and say that they're moving towards a better world. And we simply want to take their words and put it in a climate charter so that we can put their money where their mouth is and really make sure that the El Pasoans have the power to make these decisions and have a say in things that are really going to impact their lives. Water, electricity, and clean air are something that all El Pasoans deserve, and we deserve to have a seat at the table, and that's what the climate charter aims to do.
Right, you mentioned electricity, and Proposition K calls for the city to buy or to consider buying El Paso Electric and doing a feasibility study. How does that fit? Can you address that? But also, how does that fit into addressing climate change?
I want to push back very assertively against that. Nowhere in the climate charter does it say buy or purchase El Paso Electric. The word that is used is municipalization. And what that refers to is the broad range of powers that the city has to fight on behalf of the public interest if that's against the private interest. We can look at Duranguito and the way that the city used its powers to devalue, to use eminent domain, to use pressure campaigns to get what they wanted for private interests. All we are asking is that the city do the same in behalf of the public interest. So for people to say that El Paso or the climate charter is demanding that the city pay or buy outright El Paso Electric is just not the case. And that to us is a very specific disinformation campaign that is not really trying to take this climate charter in good faith and have a substantive conversation, but instead sort of fear monger. The price that they pay or price that they name as $9 billion is a very questionable price. Where did that price come from? Most people were already questioning the $4.3 billion price tag that it was sold for. So just because El Paso Electric and the other businesses in the Chamber of Commerce might feel that it's worth that much does not necessarily mean that it's worth that much. And the city has tools that they can use to properly assess what the value is. And that's what we are asking for in the feasibility study. When El Paso Electric was first being sold to JP Morgan, that was one of the first things we asked for, because during that time, the city of El Paso had powers to intervene and to name their price and to sort of start the municipalization process there. But so many years later, we've yet to see a feasibility study. But that feasibility study is critical into really properly assessing the value of El Paso Electric.
Municipalized by, how do you separate those two words?
I encourage people to Google, because municipalization means that the city has powers to name the price of these assets that they have. In the Moscow study that Ms. Hutchins referred to, it actually implicates El Paso Electric in the failure of their business to invest in their own infrastructure. It names a really inflated price tag, in my opinion, on the electrification costs. But we should be asking ourselves, well, why isn't this billion-dollar company investing in their own electric company? It also talks about workers' transition. The workers that are trained in fossil fuels now and wanting to go to the renewable energies, they need to also be trained. And in this study, it talks about how much it's going to cost. Again, why are we not asking the billion-dollar company who owns El Paso Electric to invest in their own workforce? And that's because time after time, the community has seen that there's just a bad faith approach to these conversations. And so the climate charter is really aimed at putting power into the city to make sure that these are not just empty promises to the community.
Ms. Hutchins, given this part of the proposal and the study, the feasibility study, what is your take on this consideration? But do you also feel there's an opportunity for the utility to create jobs around this?
So I would agree that there is definitely a difference between municipalization and buying. However, either way, it does cost the taxpayer money. Right now, there is one study that shows the estimated value, and I have not seen another study. So that is what we are going off of based on our business concerns. As far as the further municipalization and whether or not this is a good idea and what jobs it creates, this isn't Cuba. And so when we talk about taking over companies that are not for sale, I feel like it is practicing things that are just not based on democratic values. When we look at a democracy and we look at a positive business climate in our community, having businesses that are able to operate with certain guidelines and with the understanding that, there does need to be policies and controls based on what businesses are able to do. Our El Paso Electric Company here in El Paso, since they were taken over by JP Morgan, has been one of the largest producers of solar in Texas for a few years running now. And so, I can't speak for El Paso Electric, but I know that they are good stewards of, employees and all sorts of things in our community. I don't know if there would be jobs created from municipalization of El Paso Electric. I can tell you that based on the input from our study, there would be more jobs lost than created.
Ms. Carbajal, considering these aspects, and I know Ms. Hutchins mentioned the solar investments, and we saw El Paso Electric announce some of its investment in New Mexico last week. Is that enough for us as a community to be addressing climate change? What are some things that we can be doing in your opinion?
Well, El Paso Electric cannot be allowed to continue to use El Paso as its dumping ground. And that's what it's done by continuing to invest millions of dollars into the creation of power plants that are powered by fossil fuels, right? Montana Vista being one of them, the extension of Newman 6, which is right on the border with New Mexico. And it is because of Newman 6 that the climate charter arose, as Dominic was saying, but also because New Mexico has been talking about climate change for much longer than Texas has. And so El Paso Electric cannot do what it wants in New Mexico. It has to invest in solar if it wants to contribute to serve and collect money from New Mexico, utility users. We don't have that. Right? No one has had the courage, either locally or at the state level, to say El Paso Electric no more. You cannot continue to blame Juarez. Let me tell you, I graduated from college in '98. I sat at so many meetings dealing with air pollution for 3 years. Ozarko, the refinery, and El Paso Electric and Job Concrete always blame Juarez for our problems. Their little projects were paving alleys in El Paso, paving streets in Juarez, blaming the brick kilns in Juarez, blaming people who burn their trash. They are the largest emitters of pollution, no question about it, right? We know that under the Biden administration, the EPA has really tried to further strengthen environmental laws. El Paso is going to be left behind again and again. We need to think ahead to 20, 30 years, and we need to be thinking about, if they can do this in New Mexico, why aren't they doing it in El Paso? And it's because they don't have to here. They can continue to exploit our environment and our utility payers. And we need to really think about what it would mean for us to own another utility company that's actually profitable. El Pasoans are saddled with the water utility, the most expensive of the three utilities. We have to invest in technology to desalinate our water. And so I am so happy that the Climate Charter is talking about water and air pollution, because we're never allowed to do that in court. We are only focusing on air pollution, and we have to pretend that there isn't a water conservation crisis in our community, which there is.
Ms. Hutchins, I know there's a lot of discussion around the cost. There's always a lot of discussion about what it'll mean for the economy. Can you address that, but also can you speak to if you foresee any benefits that the proposals might have for the community?
So I would like to start that response by just mentioning that Ms. Carbajal mentioned that the water utility is the most expensive out of the three utilities. And I would like to point out that that particular utility is the only one that's municipally owned. So when we talk about being good stewards of our taxpayer money, I don't know that creating another municipally owned utility would be doing that. Now, whether or not the chamber sees any benefit to Prop K, we were in support of Prop C. We still are. We are still working with the city to ensure that everything that moves forward regarding Prop C, which voters paid $5 million to approve, be moved forward. We are pro-positive climate in El Paso. We want to work with our partners at the city with good legislation that has input from all stakeholders. We don't feel like Prop K did have a lot of input from local stakeholders. As is seen by the donations from Ground Game Texas, a large majority of what was donated, actually all of what was donated outside of the community, as was a large portion of what was written into Prop K. So while I would love to say that there was a component of Prop K that we could be supportive of, truly, we think that Prop C is where most of our efforts should be going from this point forward.
Mr. Chacon, just given some of the dialogue around the cost, but also I've heard from your colleagues about the criticism with the city of El Paso when it comes to explaining the benefits as well. Can you speak to both of those issues and in regards to a little of the discussion what we are trying to have about how this addresses climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, it should be no surprise to anybody that a business that is a monopoly and has our community as a captured market is of course going to be threatened by the idea of having to compete fairly with other energy industries. And we've seen that from the city from the get-go. As I said, this climate charter did not come out of thin air as much as people would like to say it is. This has come from a long fight that has been happening. And time and again, community leaders, both young and of older generations, have showed up to city council and have made the case and have shown how other cities in Texas are doing the same thing that we're asking for. But somehow the message keeps getting confused or manipulated to make it seem like the climate charter is 39,000 people signed the climate charter because they're concerned about El Paso Electric, when the reality is 39,000 people signed the climate charter because they're concerned about their environment here in El Paso, because they see how high the rates of electricity are. They see how future generations are already dealing with the impacts of climate change. And so it sort of feels like banging your head against the wall, trying to have a good faith conversation with people who are committed to misunderstanding. And so what I would say to Ms. Hutchins is we are the community that are the stakeholders. We did bring people together much longer, and we don't feel that fossil fuel industries who have lied to our community deserve a seat at that table. What they really need is to be held accountable. And this is democracy in action, right? We are practicing democracy by getting people to understand what the problem is, to sign onto the citizen-led initiative, and then to vote on it this coming May. And so it's been exceptionally eye-opening, I would say, for young people to just see how dysfunctional city government is, from the local levels, selling of El Paso Electric to JP Morgan Chase to Newman 6. And just as Ms. Carbajal explained, these ideas that we're proposing are not impossible. They're happening just across the imaginary border of New Mexico and Texas, where somehow you cross over there and then it is possible, but then you come over here and suddenly it's not. So there's a commitment to misunderstanding that I think we should address.
Ms. Carbajal, as one of the state's largest cities and major city in this country, whether or not this proposition passes, what should the city of El Paso's role be in addressing climate change?
Well, to be clear, Proposition C is really small, right? It is focused on $5 million and on city-owned buildings and doing roof solar on them. That's great. That is a beginning, and that should have been a beginning a very long time ago. But I hope that in our community, we start to see the connection between our electrical usage and our water consumption, that we start to see the connection between transportation projects like the I-10 Connect, now Downtown 10, now the Bridge of the Americas $600 million modernization plan, and what is happening to our jobs, right? We haven't even spoken about jobs. People in El Paso, young people especially, are still leaving the city. And so I would say that neither the city nor either chamber nor El Paso Electric are the authority on the environment, much less jobs, because people are still leaving the community. And so we are seeing more and more commercial trucking, more and more warehousing. And we know that transportation is also a huge contributor to climate change, as is the production of energy. So where do we see any promise? Familias Unidas del Chamizal, brought a lawsuit a couple of years ago to force the EPA to take back the waiver that basically said our problems are because of Juarez. And El Paso Electric was against that. They're against it now. And so I hope that moving forward, we start to have very real conversations about the fact that our earth and our city are warming at an alarming rate. It is April and it already feels like June. People who are elderly and vulnerable and have respiratory issues are going to be using city-funded community centers as cooling centers because their homes are too hot. People die of heat stroke. People cannot go to work if they work outdoors in either it's construction or agriculture. All of these different things are related, and we're taking back our power from big money in the community. Well,
thank you all so much for your input in today's discussion, and that's all the time we have. And thank you all at home for watching. A reminder, Election Day is May 6th. Early voting starts on April 24th through May 2nd. You can vote at any early voting location of your choice. For information on elections or the locations, visit epcountyvotes.com. On behalf of PBS El Paso and KTEP News, thank you.